The building I eventually purchased was a former department store in downtown Atlanta that had been vacant for over a decade. It was 50,000 square feet of pure potential wrapped in 1920s architecture, with soaring ceilings, original hardwood floors, and the kind of natural light that makes artifacts glow like they're telling their own stories. Of course, it was also a financial nightmare. The asking price was $1.2 million, and I had exactly $30,000 in savings and a credit score that made bank loan officers look at me like I'd suggested financing a trip to Mars. That's when I learned about the power of community investment. Instead of approaching traditional banks, I decided to crowdfund the purchase through the very communities whose stories the museum would tell. I organized house parties, church presentations, and community meetings throughout the Southeast, sharing my vision and asking people to invest in their own history. The response was overwhelming. Teachers contributed their tax refunds. Church congregations took up special collections. Small business owners hosted fundraising events. Families sent $20 bills with handwritten notes saying they wanted their children to have a place where they could see themselves reflected in history. Within 18 months, we'd raised enough for the down payment and secured a community development loan for the remainder. The Williams Heritage Museum was no longer just my dream, it had become our collective vision. The renovation took 2 years. I learned more about construction, electrical systems, and museum-grade climate control than I ever thought possible. I also learned about the incredible generosity of skilled tradespeople who believed in the project enough to work at reduced rates or donate their expertise entirely. Carlos, our electrician, spent his evenings and weekends installing the specialized lighting systems needed to properly display historical documents. "My kids are going to learn their history in this place," he told me one evening as we worked side by side, running cables through century-old walls. "That's worth more than any paycheck." Maria, our master carpenter, handcrafted display cases that were both beautiful and functional, using traditional techniques that would have made the original craftsmen of the building proud. "Every piece of wood tells a story," she said. "Just like every artifact you're going to put in these cases." By the time we opened our doors in September of last year, the Williams Heritage Museum had become more than an institution. It had become a symbol of what's possible when communities invest in themselves and their own narratives. Our grand opening was a celebration that lasted 3 days. We had visitors from 12 states, including several families whose stories and artifacts were featured in our exhibits. Local news stations covered the event, but more importantly, people who had never felt welcome in traditional cultural institutions felt ownership and pride in this space that truly belonged to them. The museum's 5 main wings tell the story of African American life in the Southeast from the 1800s to the present day. Our Freedom and Resistance Wing documents both famous and lesser-known acts of courage during the Civil Rights era, including oral histories from people who lived through those transformative times. Our Arts and Innovation Wing showcases the incredible creativity that flourished despite systemic barriers, from folk art to contemporary installations. Our Family and Community Wing celebrates the everyday heroes, the teachers, domestic workers, small business owners, and community leaders who built strong families and neighborhoods against incredible odds. Our Education and Achievement Wing highlights the scholars, inventors, and professionals who excelled in their fields while opening doors for others to follow. And our Contemporary Voices Wing features rotating exhibits that connect historical struggles to current social justice movements, showing how the past informs present-day activism and community building. But perhaps my favorite space is our Community Story Circle, where visitors can record their own family histories to be preserved in our digital archives. In just 1 year, we've collected over 500 oral histories from people ranging in age from 8 to 98, creating a living, breathing testament to the ongoing story of our community. The success of the museum exceeded every projection I'd made in my original business plan. We were averaging 2,000 visitors per month, hosting school groups from throughout the region, and collaborating with universities on research projects. Local families were bringing their relatives from out of town specifically to visit the museum, and tour groups were adding us to their Atlanta itineraries. Most importantly, the museum was serving its intended purpose as a community gathering space. We hosted monthly forums on current events, quarterly family history workshops, and annual celebrations that brought together multiple generations to share stories, food, and fellowship. It was exactly what I dreamed of when I was 8 years old, standing in that history center with my grandmother, wondering where our stories were being told. Which brings me back to that Saturday morning in October, and the reminder that even in spaces we create for dignity and respect, we must remain vigilant about ensuring those values are actually practiced. Conflict/discrimination incident. It was a beautiful Saturday morning in October. The autumn leaves were painting the trees around our museum in brilliant oranges and golds, and I was excited to bring my extended family for what should have been a routine visit. My parents were in town from Georgia along with my aunt, uncle, and 2 teenage cousins who had never seen the museum I'd been working on for over a decade. We'd planned this as a special family day. I wanted them to experience the museum the way any visitor would, to take the guided tour, see the exhibits fresh, and feel the pride I felt every single day walking through those halls. So I decided not to announce myself as the owner. I just wanted to be Amara, the daughter, niece, and cousin, sharing this incredible space with the people I loved most. My parents had driven up from Macon the night before, staying in the guest room of my downtown loft apartment. Over breakfast that morning, my father, Dr. James Williams, a retired professor of English literature from Fort Valley State University, expressed his excitement about finally seeing the museum in person. "You know, sweetheart," he said, spreading honey on his biscuit with the same precision he'd once used to grade papers, "your grandmother would be so proud to see what you've built. She always said you were destined for something special." My mother, Patricia, smiled as she sipped her coffee. At 65, she'd recently retired from her position as a head nurse at a regional hospital, a career that had spanned 4 decades and touched thousands of lives. "I still remember when you were little, always asking questions about everything. Why this? Why that? Who decided this was the way things should be? I should have known you'd grow up to be someone who didn't just ask questions but worked to change the answers." My Aunt Denise and Uncle Robert had driven down from Birmingham with their twins, Jasmine and Jordan, both juniors in high school. The kids were polite but clearly more interested in their phones than in what they probably viewed as another boring family obligation. I was hoping the museum might spark something for them, the way visiting that history center had sparked something for me at their age. We approached the museum's grand entrance at exactly 10:15 a.m., 15 minutes early for the 10:30 tour. The morning sun was streaming through the tall glass windows, illuminating the bronze sculpture of Harriet Tubman that graced our lobby. I felt that familiar surge of pride as we walked through the doors I'd helped design. The lobby was bustling with visitors, families, school groups, art enthusiasts. Behind the welcome desk stood Marcus Thompson, our weekend tour guide. He was a young man in his mid-20s, enthusiastic about history, with a master's degree in museum studies from Georgia State University. I'd hired him myself 6 months earlier, impressed by his knowledge and apparent passion for education. Marcus came highly recommended from his professors and had excellent references from internships at the Atlanta History Center and the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park. During his interview, he'd spoken eloquently about the importance of making history accessible to all visitors and his commitment to inclusive education. "I believe museums should be places where everyone feels welcome and valued," he told me during our interview. "History belongs to all of us, and it's our job as educators to help people see themselves reflected in these stories." His performance over the first 5 months had been exemplary. Visitors consistently rated his tours highly, praising his knowledge, enthusiasm, and ability to engage both adults and children. Several families had specifically mentioned him in their feedback forms, describing how he'd made history come alive for their kids. Which is why what happened next was so particularly jarring. As we approached the desk, I noticed a group of about 8 white visitors already gathered near the tour starting point. They were well-dressed, clearly tourists with expensive cameras and designer handbags. Marcus was animated as he spoke with them, gesturing enthusiastically about the upcoming tour. "This is going to be such a treat for you folks," I overheard him saying. "The collection we have here is really quite sophisticated. The research behind these exhibits is graduate-level work, really cutting-edge scholarship." The group nodded appreciatively, several of them taking photos of the lobby's architectural details and the bronze sculpture. "Excuse me," I said politely as we reached the desk. "We're here for the 10:30 guided tour." Marcus glanced up briefly, his eyes barely registering our presence before immediately returning to the other group. The change in his demeanor was instant and jarring. The enthusiasm that had been evident in his voice moments before completely disappeared. "The tour's filling up," he said dismissively, not even making eye contact. "You might want to try the self-guided option." I felt my stomach tighten, but I maintained my composure. "We specifically made reservations for the guided tour," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "William's party of 6. Without looking at his reservation list, a detail that didn't escape my father's notice, Marcus waved vaguely toward a rack of brochures. "Like I said, self-guided might be better for you. The real tour covers complex historical concepts that require, well, a certain level of background knowledge." The silence that followed was deafening. My father, A man who had spent 35 years teaching literature to college students, stood straighter beside me. My teenage cousins looked confused and hurt. My mother's hand found mine, squeezing gently, a gesture I remembered from childhood when the world felt unfair. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, my voice still controlled but firm. "We have confirmed reservations and we're specifically interested in the guided experience." Marcus finally looked directly at me, his expression patronizing in a way that made my skin crawl. It was a look I recognized from countless experiences throughout my academic and professional career, the expression of someone who had already decided what I was capable of understanding before I'd even spoken. "Look, this isn't exactly your kind of place. The content might go over your heads. There's a nice natural history museum about 20 minutes away that might be more appropriate." The words hit like a physical blow. Here I was, standing in the museum I'd built from the ground up, being told it wasn't for people like me. The irony was so sharp it almost took my breath away. But what made it even worse was the realization that this wasn't just about me. My family was witnessing this. My cousins, who were already at an age where they were forming their understanding of how the world would treat them, were seeing an adult tell them they weren't smart enough to understand their own history. I watched as Marcus turned back to the other group, immediately brightening. "Now folks, you're in for a real treat today. This tour covers some of the most sophisticated elements of African American intellectual history, really advanced stuff. The woman who founded this place did her doctoral work at Emory, very impressive scholarship." The casual way he praised my own academic credentials while simultaneously dismissing my family's ability to understand them was breathtaking in its audacity. One of the white tourists, an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes, looked uncomfortable. She glanced back at our group, then at Marcus, clearly sensing that something was wrong with this interaction. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly, "but didn't these folks say they had reservations?" Marcus barely glanced in our direction. "They're all set with the self-guided materials. Trust me, it's better this way. The guided tour really requires a certain level of preparation." My Uncle Robert, who had remained silent up to this point, stepped forward. As a veteran and retired postal supervisor, he wasn't easily intimidated. "Son, what exactly are you suggesting about our level of preparation?" The question hung in the air, its implications clear to everyone in the lobby. Other visitors had begun to notice the interaction. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed oblivious, but I could feel the weight of their attention. Marcus, perhaps realizing he was on dangerous ground, attempted to backtrack. "I'm not suggesting anything specific. I'm just saying that different people have different interests, and there are other cultural options in the city that might be more engaging for your family." "Engaging?" my Aunt Denise repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You think African American history wouldn't be engaging for an African American family?" "That's not what I meant," Marcus said quickly, but his face was flushing red. "I just think, look, some of this content deals with difficult subjects, complex social issues. It's not exactly family-friendly." The suggestion that black families couldn't handle the complexity of their own historical experiences was so absurd it would have been laughable if it weren't so deeply insulting. My cousin Jasmine, who was 16 and sharper than Marcus gave her credit for, spoke up for the first time. "Are you seriously telling us that we can't understand black history because we're black?" The simple, direct question from a teenager cut through all of Marcus's careful euphemisms and laid bare the absurdity of what was happening. Rising tension. For a moment, I stood frozen, watching this young man, whom I had hired, whom I had trusted to represent my vision, dismiss my family with such casual cruelty. The lobby had grown quieter, with more people beginning to pay attention to our conversation. My aunt stepped closer to me. "Amara, maybe we should just—" "No," I said quietly but with a steel in my voice that surprised even me. "We're not leaving." The word "no" seemed to echo through the lobby space, and I realized I'd spoken louder than I intended. But I didn't care. This was my museum, built on the principle that every person deserved to see their story honored and respected. Watching my family being treated this way in the space I'd created specifically to counter such treatment was unacceptable. Marcus looked startled by my firm response. He was clearly expecting us to quietly accept his dismissal and leave, as so many people do when faced with discriminatory treatment in professional settings. "Ma'am, there's no need to raise your voice," he said, his tone now taking on a condescending authority. "I'm just trying to help you have the best possible experience." "The best possible experience," my father repeated slowly, his professorial training evident in the way he dissected the phrase. And you've determined that the best possible experience for us is to be excluded from the very tour we made reservations for? I could see Marcus beginning to lead the other group toward the first exhibition hall, the very hall where my own doctoral thesis research was displayed in an interactive format. The hall where I'd spent countless late nights perfecting every detail of the lighting, the positioning of artifacts, the flow of information. As they walked away, I heard one of the tourists ask Marcus about the museum's founding. His response made my blood run cold. "Oh, this place was started by some wealthy donors who wanted to make themselves feel better about social issues," he said dismissively, his voice carrying back to us across the lobby. "The actual intellectual work was done by real historians from the university. The current management is, well, let's just say they're more about the business side than the academic rigor." The casualness with which he dismissed not only my academic credentials but also the community investment that had made the museum possible was staggering. In a few sentences, he had erased the years of research, the hundreds of community contributors, and the scholarly rigor that had gone into every exhibit. But what struck me most was the confidence with which he spoke these lies. He wasn't hesitating or hedging. He was stating what he apparently believed to be facts about the institution where he worked. I felt my family's eyes on me, waiting to see how I would respond. This was my moment of choice. I could walk away, complain later, handle this through proper channels. I could avoid a scene, maintain my composure, and address this issue privately through human resources. Or I could stand up, not just for myself, but for every person who had ever been judged, dismissed, or underestimated because of the color of their skin. But I also felt something else, a deep sadness. This young man, who worked in a museum dedicated to celebrating African American achievement, who surrounded himself daily with stories of resilience and triumph, had somehow learned to perpetuate the very attitudes our institution was meant to challenge. How had someone who spent his days guiding people through exhibits about the intellectual contributions of Black scholars come to believe that Black visitors couldn't understand complex historical concepts? How had someone who worked surrounded by artifacts proving the sophistication of African American culture concluded that African American families needed to be directed elsewhere for appropriate entertainment? The questions swirled through my mind as I watched him confidently lead his group toward exhibits that documented the exact kind of discrimination he was perpetrating. My cousin Jordan, Jasmine's twin brother, broke the silence. "This is crazy," he said, his 17-year-old voice cracking slightly with emotion. "He's literally telling us we're too stupid for Black history." His words crystallized the absurdity of the situation. Here was a teenager who could see clearly what the adult museum professional either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. My mother stepped beside me, her nurse's training evident in the way she assessed the situation with calm professionalism. "Amara," she said quietly, "this is your house. What do you want to do?" Her words reminded me of something crucial. This wasn't just any museum where we were being mistreated. This was the institution I had built, the vision I had brought to life, the space I had created specifically to ensure that families like mine would always be welcomed and honored. I looked around the lobby, at the bronze sculpture of Harriet Tubman that I had commissioned from a local artist, at the walls displaying quotes from Frederick Douglass and Maya Angelou that I had personally selected, at the welcome statement engraved in stone near the entrance that read, "Every story matters. Every voice deserves to be heard. Every person belongs here." Those weren't just pretty words, they were the founding principles of everything I had worked to build. And right now, in the most public way possible, those principles were being violated by my own employee. I made my decision. Turning point/twist. Walking calmly to the information desk, I picked up the internal phone and dialed security. My voice was steady and clear, carrying across the lobby with the authority of someone who belonged exactly where she was standing. "This is Dr. Williams," I said clearly, making sure my voice reached not just security but everyone in the lobby. "Could you please ask Marcus to bring his tour group back to the lobby? There's been a significant misunderstanding that needs to be addressed immediately." The change in the lobby's atmosphere was immediate. Conversation stopped. The school group that had been chattering near the gift shop fell silent. The family studying the museum map looked up. Even the security guard at the entrance turned to see what was happening. Marcus, now at the far end of the hall, stopped mid-sentence in whatever he was saying to his tour group. I could see him processing what he'd just heard. Dr. Williams was a name he knew well, the name on his employment contract, the name on the building's dedication plaque, the name he'd just dismissed as belonging to wealthy donors, rather than serious scholars. As he led the confused tour group back toward the lobby, I pulled out my phone and called my assistant director, Sarah Chin, who I knew was in her office preparing for a board meeting scheduled for later that afternoon. "Sarah, could you please come to the lobby?" And bring the museum's founding documents, my credentials folder, and the original architectural plans. Sarah, who had been with me since the museum's opening and had become both a trusted colleague and a close friend, immediately heard something in my tone that told her this wasn't a routine request. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "We're about to have a very important teaching moment," I replied. "One that's been a long time coming." By now Marcus had returned, his face pale with dawning realization. The tour group looked confused, unsure whether to be annoyed or curious about the delay. I could see him trying to process the situation, his eyes darting between me and the phone I'd used to call security, clearly trying to figure out if he'd misheard my name. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, addressing the gathered crowd in the lobby, my voice calm but carrying clearly through the space. "I apologize for the interruption. I'm Dr. Amara Williams and I'm the founder, owner, and director of this museum." The silence was complete now. Even the ambient museum sounds, the gentle hum of climate control, the soft background music, seemed to pause. "I'm also the woman your tour guide just told didn't belong here." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of shock and discomfort throughout the lobby. I could see people's expressions changing as they began to understand what they had witnessed. Marcus stumbled backward, his face now ashen. "Dr. Williams, I never." I held up a gentle hand, stopping his stammered apologies. "Marcus, I'm not angry with you. But I am deeply disappointed, and I think this is a teaching moment for all of us." Sarah arrived with the requested documents, her expression showing she'd quickly grasped the situation. As my assistant director and closest collaborator, she understood better than anyone how much this museum meant to me and how devastating it must be to experience discrimination in the very space I'd created to combat it. She handed me the folder, and I pulled out my doctoral diploma from Emory University, my museum certification, the original business plan, and the architectural plans bearing my signature. This museum exists because I spent 7 years earning my PhD in African American Studies, specializing in cultural preservation and community education. I began holding up my diploma for everyone to see. It exists because I worked 3 jobs while writing my dissertation on the intersection of art, history, and social justice. It exists because I believe that every person, regardless of their background, deserves to see their history honored and preserved. I turned to address the original tour group, who were now listening with rapt attention. "Marcus told you that this museum was started by guilty wealthy donors and that the real intellectual work was done by university historians. That's not entirely wrong. I am a university historian. I taught at Emory University for 8 years before founding this institution. The difference is, I'm also the woman he just judged incapable of understanding complex historical concepts." I pulled out the architectural plans, spreading them on the reception desk. "I designed the layout of these exhibits. I wrote the educational materials you'll encounter on the tour. I conducted many of the oral history interviews that form the foundation of our Community Voices collection. I personally selected and authenticated many of the artifacts you'll see today." One of the tourists, the elderly white woman with silver hair who had seemed uncomfortable earlier, stepped forward. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Dr. Williams, I owe you an apology. I stood by and watched that young man dismiss you and your family and I said nothing. That was wrong of me." Her words seemed to break a dam. Other visitors began speaking up, some apologizing, others expressing admiration for what I'd built. A young black girl who had been visiting with her school group approached me with wide eyes. "You really own this whole museum?" she asked. I knelt down to her level, seeing myself at 8 years old, standing in that history center with my grandmother. "I do," I replied. "And you know what? Someday you could build something even bigger and more beautiful than this." She grinned, her smile so bright it seemed to illuminate the entire lobby. "Can I work here when I grow up?" "If you study hard and follow your dreams," I told her, "there will always be a place for you here." Marcus, who had been standing frozen throughout this exchange, finally found his voice. "Dr. Williams, there's no excuse for what I did. I let my own assumptions and prejudices override everything this museum stands for. Everything you've taught us in our training sessions." I looked at him for a long moment, seeing not just the young man who had hurt my family, but also someone who could learn and grow from this experience. Someone who, despite his mistakes, was standing in a museum surrounded by stories of people who had overcome far worse treatment and found ways to transform pain into progress. "Marcus, you're not fired," I said, surprising everyone including him. The relief on his face was immediate, but I held up my hand to continue. "But you are going to take a very different kind of training. You're going to spend the next month working with our community outreach coordinator, visiting schools and underserved neighborhoods, talking to families who often feel unwelcome in cultural institutions. You're going to learn why this work matters and why every person who walks through those doors deserves respect and dignity. You're also going to research and write a presentation about unconscious bias in cultural institutions. You'll present it to our entire staff, and it will become part of our ongoing training program. Because if this happened with you, it's probably happening with other staff members in ways we haven't recognized yet. The gratitude on his face was evident, but more importantly, I could see understanding beginning to dawn. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll do better. I promise I'll do better." I turned back to my family, who had watched this entire exchange with a mixture of pride, amazement, and vindication. "Now," I said, my voice returning to its earlier warmth, "would you like that guided tour? Because I happen to know someone who can give you the most comprehensive tour you've ever experienced." Resolution. What followed was the most meaningful tour I had ever given. As we walked through the museum that day, I shared not just the history displayed in our exhibits, but the story of how each piece came to be there. I told them about the late nights spent writing grant applications, the joy of acquiring our first major artifact, the community meetings where neighbors shared their family treasures to be preserved for future generations. In the Freedom and Resistance Wing, I introduced my family to Mrs. Dorothy Mason, a 89-year-old volunteer who had participated in the 1960 lunch counter sit-ins in Atlanta. She happened to be in the museum that day sharing her story with a group of middle school students. "Mrs. Mason," I said, "I'd like you to meet my family. This is my father, Dr. James Williams, who taught literature for 35 years. Mrs. Mason's eyes lit up as she shook my father's hand. "A professor. You know, during the movement it was teachers and professors who often took the biggest risks. They had the most to lose, their jobs, their careers, but they stood up anyway." As she and my father fell into conversation about the role of education in the civil rights movement, I watched my teenage cousins listening with genuine interest. This was exactly what I had envisioned when I created this space. Not just displays behind glass but living connections between past and present. In the Arts and Innovation Wing, my mother was particularly drawn to an exhibit about African American nurses during World War II. "I had no idea," she said, reading about the struggles of black nurses who served their country while facing discrimination within the military medical system. "These women paved the way for everything I was able to accomplish in my career." My Aunt Denise spent a long time in our family and community wing, studying photographs of church congregations, community organizations, and neighborhood celebrations from throughout the 20th century. "Look at this," she called to my Uncle Robert, pointing to a 1950s photograph of a church picnic. "That could be our family reunion last summer. Same proud faces, same sense of community." But it was in the Education and Achievement Wing that my cousins really came alive. Jasmine was fascinated by the story of Dr. Mae Jemison, the first African-American woman astronaut. Jordan was drawn to an exhibit about black inventors whose contributions had been overlooked by mainstream history books. "I want to be an engineer," Jordan told me as we stood in front of a display about Granville Woods, who invented the railway telegraph. "I never knew there were black inventors who created things that changed the world." "There have always been black innovators and creators," I told him. "The difference is that now we're making sure their stories are told." As we moved through the museum, other visitors began joining our conversation. The elderly white woman who had apologized earlier, Mrs. Henderson, asked thoughtful questions about the artifacts and their historical context. The school group that had witnessed the earlier confrontation asked if they could extend their visit to hear more about the museum's founding. "This is what I dreamed of," I told my family as we stood in the community story circle, where digital screens displayed excerpts from the oral histories we'd collected. Not just a museum, but a gathering place where people can connect across generations and experiences. My father, who had been relatively quiet throughout the tour, finally spoke up. "Amara, what you've built here is more than a museum. It's a testament to the power of believing in yourself and your community, even when others doubt your capabilities." He paused, looking around at the walls covered with photographs, documents, and artifacts that told the story of resilience and achievement. "That young man who dismissed us today, he learned something important. But I think everyone here learned something. Including me." "What did you learn, Daddy?" I asked. "I learned that my daughter didn't just build a museum. She built a bridge. A bridge between what was and what could be. Between people who might never have had a reason to talk to each other. Between the past that shaped us and the future we're still creating." As our tour concluded, Marcus approached us hesitantly. He had spent the last 2 hours observing the interactions between my family and other visitors, seeing firsthand how the museum functioned when everyone was treated with dignity and respect. "Dr. Williams," he said, "I've been watching and listening, and I realize I didn't just make a mistake today. I missed an opportunity. Your family brought exactly the kind of knowledge and perspective that makes these stories come alive. I'm sorry I was too blind to see that." He turned to my parents. "Dr. Williams, Mrs. Williams, I hope you'll give me a chance to make this right. I'd be honored to learn from your experiences and perspectives." My father, ever the educator, extended his hand to Marcus. "Son, we all have blind spots. The question is what we do when they're pointed out to us. Learning and growing, that's all any of us can do." As we prepared to leave that afternoon, the young girl from the school group ran up to me one more time. "Dr. Williams, I told my teacher I want to come back here with my whole family. And I'm going to start keeping a journal about my grandmother's stories, just like you did." Walking to the parking lot with my family, I felt a complex mix of emotions. The day had started with hurt and disappointment, but it had transformed into something deeper, a reminder of why this work mattered and a demonstration of how even painful experiences could become opportunities for growth and connection. "You handled that beautifully," my mother said as we reached our cars. "You could have embarrassed that young man, could have made him feel as small as he tried to make us feel. Instead, you chose to educate and elevate." "That's the choice we always have," I replied. "We can respond to ignorance with anger, or we can respond with truth and grace. Both are valid, but one has the power to change hearts and minds." My uncle Robert, who had driven up from Birmingham specifically for this visit, shook his head in amazement. "Amara, your grandmother would be so proud. Not just of what you built, but of how you carried yourself today. You showed that young man what dignity looks like." Closing message/life lesson. That incident happened 6 months ago, and it changed more than just Marcus's perspective. It became a catalyst for conversations throughout our community about assumptions, dignity, and the importance of seeing each person as a complete human being with their own unique story and value. Marcus, true to his word, has become one of our most thoughtful and inclusive tour guides. The presentation he developed on unconscious bias has been requested by 3 other museums in our region, and he's become a leader in our ongoing efforts to make cultural institutions more welcoming and accessible to all visitors. Most importantly, he's learned to see every visitor as someone with something valuable to contribute to the conversation. His tours now include questions and opportunities for visitors to share their own family stories and connections to the history being presented. The elderly woman who apologized that day, Mrs. Henderson, became one of our most dedicated volunteers and has brought dozens of her friends to experience our museum. She now co-facilitates our monthly intergenerational dialogue sessions, where visitors of different ages and backgrounds share stories and learn from each other. The young girl who asked if I really owned the museum visited again the following month with her entire extended family. She's now part of our youth advisory board, helping us develop programs that engage young people in historical preservation and storytelling. But perhaps the most significant change has been within our own institution. That day forced us to examine our training procedures, our hiring practices, and our ongoing efforts to ensure that our values are reflected not just in our exhibits but in every interaction visitors have with our staff. We now require all employees to participate in quarterly unconscious bias training. We've established a visitor feedback system that specifically asks about their experience with staff interactions. And we've created a community advisory board that includes representatives from the neighborhoods and communities whose stories we tell, ensuring that our programming and presentation remains authentic and respectful. As for me, I learned something important too. I learned that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger or confrontation. It's simply refusing to diminish yourself to fit someone else's limited expectations. It's standing in your truth with such clarity and grace that you give others permission to examine their own assumptions and choose to do better. That Saturday taught me that building the museum was only the first step. Creating the physical space where stories could be told and preserved was crucial, but ensuring that the space truly welcomed and honored every visitor required ongoing vigilance and commitment. It reminded me that prejudice and discrimination don't disappear just because we build institutions dedicated to fighting them. They live in individual hearts and minds, and they require individual moments of choice to be overcome. But it also reminded me of something even more important. That change is possible. That people can grow and learn and choose to be better than they were before. That moments of pain and disappointment can become opportunities for connection and understanding. The Williams Heritage Museum stands today not just as a repository of African American history, but as a testament to what's possible when we refuse to accept other people's narrow definitions of who we are and what we're capable of achieving. Every day as I walk through those halls I built, I'm reminded of the journey that brought me here. The little girl who dreamed of seeing her stories told. The graduate student who believed community voices mattered. The professor who left the security of academia to build something entirely new. The entrepreneur who convinced an entire region to invest in their own history. But most of all, I'm reminded of that Saturday when my family and I walked through those doors as visitors, only to encounter the same attitudes and assumptions that the museum exists to challenge. That day could have been a defeat, a sign that even our best efforts to create change weren't enough. Instead, it became a victory, not because I got to reveal my position of authority, but because it created an opportunity for growth, learning, and genuine connection between people who might never have truly seen each other otherwise. They judged me by my appearance and made assumptions about my capabilities. I responded by showing them the depth of my knowledge, the strength of my character, and the power of leading with dignity rather than defensiveness. Because here's what I've learned in my 38 years on this earth. You can't control how others see you initially, but you can absolutely control how you choose to respond. You can choose to let their limitations become your limitations, or you can choose to stand so firmly in your own worth that you create space for them to expand their understanding. The power we all possess isn't just the power to overcome prejudice. It's the power to transform those experiences into opportunities for growth, understanding, and positive change. It's the power to respond to ignorance with education, to meet dismissal with dignity, and to turn moments of pain into bridges of connection. That's the real lesson of that October day. Not that discrimination doesn't exist, even in spaces specifically created to combat it. Not that good intentions automatically translate into good outcomes. But that every moment of prejudice is also a moment of possibility, a chance to choose whether we'll perpetuate old patterns or create new possibilities. Because at the end of the day, we all have museums to build, whether they're made of brick and mortar or built from the relationships we nurture, the barriers we break down, and the example we set for the generations who will follow in our footsteps. And every time we choose dignity over defensiveness, education over anger, and growth over grudges, we're laying another foundation stone for a world where every person who walks through any door, literal or metaphorical, is met with the respect and recognition that every human being deserves. That's the museum I built. That's the legacy I'm committed to leaving. And that's the choice I'll make every day, for as long as I have the privilege of doing this work. Word count, approximately 8,000 words. Note, this expanded script maintains its focus on dignity, empowerment, and positive resolution while providing the comprehensive length requested. The story emphasizes personal achievement, community building, and the transformative power of responding to discrimination with grace and strength.